Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Comms in Crisis webinar, in which we're going to be unpicking the landscape of compliant communications. Before we get started, and before I introduce our excellent speakers, I'll just set the scene as to why we're here today. So, for a long time, as many of you really will know, firms have been required to capture and preserve business communication across all channels. In the last few years, we've seen quite significant regulatory fines, now totaling around $2 billion. And this has been predominantly focused for WhatsApp so far and been focused in the US. But what we're starting to see is that's also coming across the pond. So the likes of the PRA, the CMA, and strangely, Ofgem have started to take action for non-compliant communication and people who are, or firms who are not capturing and preserving business communication. So at the beginning of the year, with all of this regulatory action in mind, we published a report in which we spoke to a number of compliance officers about how they are managing this kind of compliant comms crisis. What are they doing about the regulatory enforcements, and how are they taking steps to kind of mitigate any risks? Today, we're going to be unpicking the findings of that report and asking really, why is it that firms are finding it so difficult to comply with compliant communications? Before I get started, a couple of housekeeping points. We are going to be doing a live Q&A at the end of this session, so please do submit any questions you have there in the chat below. And I'm also going to do a shameless plug and let you know that as well as the report that we're talking about today, we have just published another report which looks at the data of 10,000 financial services to assess and analyze how they are capturing data. So if you want to know how your peers are capturing communication channels, what channels that they are capturing, and loads of other really juicy information, you can find that in the resources section alongside the report we'll be discussing today. And I should also mention that Hoda has written a fantastic article for us, which you can also find in the resources, which is focusing on tone at the top and whether there are other more practical steps for compliance. So with that, I will move to introduce our speakers, who will come to the screen in a moment. I'm joined today by our very own Director of Regulatory Intelligence, Rob Mason. Rob has several years of experience, both working at the regulator and then moving into compliance at investment banks as well. We've also got Hoda Adin Mohammed. She is a corporate compliance expert at Nordic Semiconductor, and she's got a wealth of experience working in compliance, but across a number of different industries. So we're not just limiting this to financial services. And finally, Scott McCleskey, who's Executive Director of Compliance Training at SMB. Similar to Rob, Scott has many years of experience working at regulators and within banks in compliance, and now is moving on to actually those practical compliance training tips. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to our speakers, and we'll move into the first question. So essentially, looking at regulatory action, we've had 59% of our respondents to our recent survey said that they are banning certain communication channels, essentially meaning that if they can't find a viable solution to capture a channel, they're telling employees they simply can't use it. Does this, and Rob, I am going to come back to you, does this surprise you, and why do you think firms are opting for bans?
Surprised and not surprised, and perhaps the vagaries of a live webinar are being demonstrated here, but at least we know we're definitely live. I think firms had always prohibited communication on non-approved channels, and I think it's fair that we can say that that hasn't been an effective solution when we see traders and managers and they're required to respond to clients often on a channel of communication which the client chooses. Now, reminding and reinforcing to colleagues regarding what channels are permitted is a reasonable first step, but this is clearly not a control. As I think we know, this has become the compliance surveillance story of the last 2 years, and regulators are undoubtedly going to be asking firms how they assess and manage this risk in a much more aggressive way. I think this will come up in almost every supervisory engagement, or whether or not there's an investigation or an examination. Saying that a channel is banned is probably not going to be enough. I think firms will look to try and reach a position that they can defend more actively. And I think the first step might be making the whole population aware, and not just those in scope of monitoring, that, for example, WhatsApp is a banned channel, but also taking further action to demonstrate compliance. Now, this could be spot checking personal devices to see if they've been used for business. Alternatively, and possibly more likely, deploying a technology solution which allows use of some of those channels which were previously banned to enable business to flow. I think it'd be fair to say that the clients and prospects which we speak to are mostly in flight in looking at a more defendable solution than just a ban.
Yeah, and the survey that I was mentioning at the beginning definitely seems to show that we are starting to see people looking for solutions rather than banning. So the trend hopefully is moving away from it. Scott, has it surprised you to see that number of people are banning solutions?
No, it doesn't surprise me. Look, at the end of the day, you've got to do something. You've got to show that you're taking some sort of action and let the regulators know, we get the message. So as Rob was saying, it's a good first step. It's not a good step. It's not going to be sufficient, but it at least shows that you are on the path until you can figure out a better, more effective way to do this. Some way that where you'll have a solution where you can actually do surveillance on these platforms. But I think one thing that we ought to kind of address right up front, because a lot of this discussion is really going to be about, is this effective? Is it not effective? And when you look at that, I think that you have to recognize that there's kind of two sets of violators out there. This is true for a lot of compliance issues, but particularly for this. You're going to have the people that are violating your policies inadvertently. They didn't know the policy was there, or they forgot. It happens. And then you're going to have the people that are the bad actors. And whatever you do, they're going to work to go around your ban or do whatever. They'll go have a conversation on the loading dock. So as we think about this and as we discuss it today, I think we always have to remember, there isn't going to be a watertight solution here. That's just not the nature of communications. And you will wind up, I think, addressing two different populations differently. One may be through training and education. The other may be through disciplinary action.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, I think, as I alluded to at the beginning, even where you maybe have a compliance solution in place, you can't get over the fact that there's still humans involved in this, and humans are not infallible beings, and there is always going to be room for error, whether they willfully make errors or kind of accidentally make errors. Hoda, I know that you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I thank Scott for some of the points that he pointed out. But I would like to challenge that a little bit and say that maybe there are three types of violators. The two that was discussed before, the inadvertent violators and the deliberate bad actors, plus another category, a third category somewhere sort of in the middle. Those who sort of know the rules exist, but think it's a minor infraction and that they either won't get caught or that they can justify it based on the circumstances. I'd also like to point out that, bans are more likely to be perhaps more effective for the first two groups, the inadvertent violators and the I can get away with it violators, but the deliberate violators will likely sort of ignore the ban. Mm-hmm. And so there is a cultural aspect to this as well. Your business culture will drive the relative size of those sort of three groups. The better your culture, smaller the two groups of deliberate violators, perhaps. And you can focus on reducing the inadvertent violators. And for the two groups of deliberate violators, you need more than just the ban. You need visible disciplinary measures and an awareness of a sort of major enforcement actions. Take Morgan Stanley as an example. After the firm received an enforcement action for the electronic communication violations, it fined its own employees who committed the violations, in some cases up to $1 million. Now that's really sending a message.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think it's something that we're really starting to see from regulators. Rob, I see that you are ready.
Yeah. I was just going to come back and just say, I think there needs to be some care around conflating the issues in this particular instance. And I agree with with Hoda generally. But I think on this communication issue, we've got people not recording communication channels, but we're not necessarily saying, and neither are the regulators, that people are carrying out bad conduct on these channels. They're just using them when they shouldn't be, or at least when the compliance team doesn't have recording or surveillance for them, which I think is a slight distinction.
If I can jump in on that, I think that's true now. I wouldn't want to be the first firm, though, that is there when the regulators push the vote out of it. I think what's unique or top of mind for regulators, it would be for me anyway, is the thing about communications is this is one of the means by which other violations occur. And if you're not recording, it's a big thing, because you not only are you not monitoring, but you can't go back and investigate when something happens. There's no trail. It really, if you don't have control over communications, if you're not recording them, if you're not surveilling them, then you are opening yourself up to a lot of these other major violations. And so you may see, perhaps it'll start with there's a violation, an AML violation or market manipulation violation, where they throw in, and you also didn't have good record keeping, so we couldn't even look as closely at this as we should have. So yes, but I think we have to kind of take a look at this in the broader terms of the whole regulatory environment.
Yeah, that's very true. It kind of transcends, doesn't it? It's part and parcel of many different things. Coming back to the channel ban element of it, I think there's a really interesting point, and I know we just kind of touched on this slightly, but within the report that we released earlier in the year, when we said 59% of compliance officers have issued bans, we then asked them if they thought those were actually effective, and 2.6% of the 59% of people that have banned it said, we don't actually think that this is a good solution, which I found to be really interesting, because they don't actually believe that they're complying, but it just feels like they've done a step towards it. So I wonder, why are teams banning certain channels of communication if they don't think it works? Is it just because of that? Does it just look like they've done something momentous, but actually they don't really believe in it?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think that it's not easy to sort of bake this through, but perhaps just a quick history lesson around this. And I think the banks had previously gone down a bank issued device policy, and then they changed that as a reduction in cost play, so that folks bought their own devices. And I think this has been a decision which was not thought perhaps through as carefully as it might have been, the implications considered. And now many are needing to perform U-turns, which has obvious cost implications, as well as making some of the decision makers look a little short-sighted. And I think while we and other compliance tech firms provide a solution which captures a number of channels, including WhatsApp, which is the one that's been cited most frequently, it's also recognised that a trader can leave the trading desk a message on their own personal device or a burner phone, and no one will ever find out. And therefore, spending budget on a solution which can never be comprehensive can feel a bit uneconomical. But I think the reality is that despite this, specific action needs to be taken so that firms can demonstrate to regulators and auditors and all of their stakeholders that they're doing what they can to manage this risk. Banning is part of that. By acting, they've recognised the risk and have taken tangible steps to manage it. I just sort of point out, I guess, as well, it didn't happen overnight. There are a number of elements to consider. There's a cost element to this. Banning is a cheap, quick solution. It also, urgency plays a role. If people are communicating on off-channel applications and they fall under the regulatory scrutiny, then they've got to do something quickly. So banning and showing regulators that you're making a huge noise about banning seems to be that necessary first step. But as I said in my earlier comment, more rigorous steps are needed for effective management.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's an interesting one, just kind of like that big ta-da, it's banned now, and actually behind the afterthought, like, this isn't really going to work out. Hoda, what do you think about that kind of thought?
Yeah, and very good points made by Rob here. I'd like to repeat a point already made, And that's that firms need to do something, and that is a start. Also, whether something is effective sort of depends a bit on what you're trying to achieve. If the only goal is to sort of bring the number of off-channel communications down to 0, then the bans might or won't be effective, and neither will anything else. But bans may still drive the bulk of the communication sort of onto approved channels that can be surveillanced. So if the goal is to increase the proportion of communication that can be surveillanced and recorded, the bans may be effective in achieving that goal.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, there's maybe a secondary purpose there to the bans. Thoughts?
No, I think I like Hoda's point that you may at least start driving more communications to where it can be surveilled. But at the end of the day, I think Rob's right. You're doing this to be seen doing something. It's not a good solution. I think nobody necessarily thinks that this is going to be the final chapter for them. It's a placeholder, I think. While you determine what kind of effective processes you can put in place or tools that you can adapt. As Rob pointed out, it takes time to do those things. In the meantime, you can't just sit there and let things go the way that they were. You may hear about that from your regulator if you do.
Yeah, I guess the kind of a question I have around it also is, do regulators actually expect you to be capturing 100% of business communications? Because as we've been talking about, a watertight solution almost seems kind of like a mythical beast. And is it actually something that we can do and regulators expect, or is 90% capture enough? I'll leave that to anyone who wants to take it.
Well, I'll have a swing at it. I'm not sure that even the regulators, would want to answer that question. I mean, on the one hand, they realize in most things you're not going to get a 100% solution. On the other hand, the first time some violations slips through, they will give you an enforcement action for it. So generally speaking, and I think most people know this in most industries, the regulators are looking for. I think what Rob called a defensible position. They're looking for an effective process. So this does take time to put in place. It will involve policies. It will involve technology and other things. But in the meantime, you are going to have some things that will slip through. I think what the regulators want to see is that you've got a process in place, but very importantly, that you actually implement it. Because when you take a look at enforcement actions these days, one of the things that they trot out every time is either you didn't have a process in place, or you had a process in place and you didn't implement it. They'll get you, coming or going. So I think it's less about 99 versus 100% and more how effective is your process? Is it reasonably designed?
Yeah, I'll pick up there, Scott. I think that's about right. I think there's a little bit of a dependency on the regulator's risk appetite and what is their key area of focus, what's the flavour of the month, and clearly this is the flavour of the month or year. So consequently, more focus needs to be put up by the regulated community. I think innovation obviously helps make this more achievable when we want to capture as much of the channel traffic as we can. So consequently, technology applications which can change and evolve with a firm will help to make that firm easier to comply going forward. I guess more generally, sort of catching 100% of malfeasance isn't possible. And I think we're closer to a more radical step in risk identification using advanced technology. So development based on the pesky lexicons that we use, the comfort and reliance which placed on them won't be easily dismissed, but I think it is happening. Without going into big detail here, I think artificial intelligence true value is going to be demonstrated as we go forward, and change the world more than we know in capital markets, I think. So let's bear that in mind. I'd also say, though, of course, manipulators or bad actors will also have access to artificial intelligence. So generally, good luck with capturing 100%. I think to your last point as well, human intervention to supervise the undertaking of surveillance to make sure that it's tested and it's validated and it remains appropriate and effective and complete still is an absolutely critical factor. And let's not forget, historically, humans understand humans, and we have proved to be incredibly good at gaming controls and outwitting them previously. So that's the case where we are at the moment. And I guess at the moment, it looks like that will be the case in the future.
Yeah.
They're very, yeah, sorry.
No, go on, Hoda.
Very good points made by both Rob and Scott there. I think if, coming from a different industry than the financial sector, I'd say even for industries that aren't as tightly sort of regulated as financial services, this is an important question because your actions may be scrutinized in litigation, right?
Yeah.
And there are, other legal and regulatory requirements in play here. When you're talking about monitoring communications or inspecting someone's sort of personal devices, there are also major privacy and rights issues like GDPR here in Europe. And you probably can't achieve zero violations of one regulation without violating the other.
That's a good point.
I think it's interesting, and I think outside of these highly regulated industries, I think it's a fair case. I would say that for the financial services population that's in the scope of regulation, the reviewers have a great responsibility, but both them and the regulators aren't going through personal emails to try and find something scandalous or titillating. Communication monitoring concentrates on a very narrow range of risks, which is a requirement in the law. So on a conduct risk basis, if you're a senior executive in a big corporation, you probably should expect to be surveilled. And if you're doing something wrong, you should be worried. I think we've seen oversight of conduct, particularly in lieu of the Crispin Odey issue, the disgraced asset manager. We've seen Looney at BP, Tilley at the CBOE. We've even seen MPs and TV stars, all of whom have lost their positions on the basis of their conduct. So that suggests, I think, that the spotlight will be on senior execs in 2024, and monitoring remains a key component in managing that risk.
Yeah, I think that, what really raised my eyebrows is the fact of, hand over your personal, coming up to somebody saying, hand over your personal device. We want to see what WhatsApp messages you've been sending. That's a shocker. And that's where I could see, we, here in the US, we don't have GDPR, but we've got other laws, particularly in California. And, like a lot of things in compliance, you're balancing the various requirements. So as it turns out, this isn't easy.
Would believe. We can see that from the
That's the sheer
volume of fines. Yeah.
Yeah. If anybody
sticking...
walks away with one thing, it's not an easy problem. Yeah.
No, it absolutely isn't. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here. Sticking on the theme of culture, and I'm going to actually skip ahead one of the questions that we were going to tackle, purely because, and I apologize for this again, because of the technical issues at the beginning, but I'm going to stick on the theme of culture and move to the fact that one of the biggest challenges that compliance officers said that they're facing is that cultural, individual employee element. So actually putting in place policies and procedures maybe wasn't the biggest challenge. It was actually getting people to listen to them. And Hoda, I know that you wrote in your article recently that actually you thought that in some senses, compliance failures can actually be more indicative of leadership failures. And this comes back to what we were just saying about senior execs and tone from the top. Do you mind expanding on that? Why do you think it is that employees are failing to kind of follow the rules, even when there are kind of clear parameters set?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first point here would be that, clear parameters may be set, but they may not be taken seriously. People absorb the attitude of their managers and won't take the parameters seriously if management doesn't. We hear a lot about tone from the top, but that's possibly maybe just a buzzword for something more fundamental: leadership. Tone from the top implies that it's all about communication. It does begin with communication, but it shouldn't really end there. Otherwise, your cultural statement and code of conduct are just empty gestures, like a cookbook, really, with no actual recipes to guide you there. Leadership, though, goes further. It's about action. Visible meeting all compliance requirements shows that compliance is a priority. My second point here would be that it might be going a bit too far to say that people are ignoring the parameters, as this may imply that they're actively or deliberately violating them. But it may be just a matter of ignorance. Awareness, therefore, training and reinforcements, I think, can address this issue.
Yeah, I'll pick up there if I may. I think that lack of compliance and that deficient sort of training and education to understand what's important is really critical. And I absolutely agree, this conduct and culture to follow the rules and that they apply to everybody. I think action and behaviour instead of a tone from the top is what was expected. And the board sets the standard in example for others to follow. I think we've seen the principles and behaviours that firms roll out generally on their websites, but they need to be lived by the board and senior managers so everyone understands what the standard is and follows it. Just bringing this back to our issue around communications, I think we saw in the final notices in the enforcement outcomes around record keeping fines, senior managers were found guilty of also using non-approved channels. Where this is happening, how can they expect others to do as I say, not as I do, and then comply? I think we've also noticed within the firms that we were discussing this with that the breach matrix has been updated. So this is the consequence of something that's gone wrong. So where a non-approved channel might have been previously resulted in a level 1 breach, and perhaps that's just a policy reminder or something quite insignificant, this has now changed. And it's now at least a level 3 breach, which will have much more material consequences, possibly disciplinary actions or even impacting compensation. So I think there's a distinct change there.
Scott,
I think if I could jump in, I think beyond. Sorry? But I think
nothing. Sorry, our audio overlapped. I'll leave it with you.
Okay. I think these are all very good points about tone from the top. I would also add that your questions about how do you get these policies and get people to actually adhere to them. I think part of it is how you write and communicate and train on the policies. And I do training now, so I've got a little bit of hard-fought experience in this. First of all, your policies need to be written clearly and succinctly. Nobody's going to say, I'm bored, I think I'm going to go read a policy. But you can make it less painful. There are people out there that would take 3 paragraphs to describe the color of an orange. Don't let them write your policies. Keep them succinct. And then when you train, make it engaging. One of my little pet peeves is, we've all seen the training, and I've even done this, where you're talking about a particular law and you cite the law up to the 5th or 6th degree. You say, here's the punishments, up to 5 years, for instance, disgorgement of profits, blah, 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 blah. Goes in one ear, out the other. I prefer to say, they don't need to know all the details. Just say, you violate this law, you're going to go to the slammer. You are going to lose your reputation. You're going to lose your career. I think the best way to do this is to provide a scenario and follow somebody and show what actually happens with this, because otherwise it's just so much text on a page. So I think that it's about making the policies digestible and then training them, communicating them in a way that's engaging and where people will actually retain this. And that might reduce the size of that group that's doing the inadvertent violations.
Yeah, 100%. I think the audio on you went slightly different there, Scott, but I could hear most of what you said. I actually wanted to come back on that point, and this probably again comes to you, Scott. But is there an argument here I've heard it a few times that actually compliance policies or compliance is actually a barrier to effective business. And is that a reason or an excuse that individuals might use when it comes to using certain channels?
Well, I've been hearing for 30 years that compliance is the business prevention department. And, I have never had much patience for that attitude, because you have to strike a balance. I mean, I don't like paying taxes, but I understand why I need to do it. And I think it's the same thing with compliance. And professionals recognize that, on the first line, the business side, as well as compliance. There are some things, I had this battle when I was a CCO, having to tell people you have to do something differently, and it will likely mean less revenues, but fewer fines. But if you're not willing to have that battle, then maybe you should consider a different line of business.
Yeah, that's a good point. Rob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I hark back to some experience that I had when I worked in investment banks. We undertook a wealth of training and were subjected to a lot, but I don't recall having training on which specific communication channel was or wasn't permitted. I think individuals want to use applications that make doing business easy, and these, I'm speaking sort of somewhat with the benefit of hindsight, and you can't train on every explicit instance of everything. I think efforts to block certain applications from a compliance perspective haven't worked. Firms need to look at technology solutions that enable business communication and probably not restrict it. But it's a good point you make.
Yes, very true. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to jump to our final question, and we're going to do a whistle stop tour of kind of successful policy and implementation. So, Hoda, in your article, you mentioned that a critical component of compliant behaviour is actually performance goals and incentives, but that they're often overlooked. So if I'll come to you first, what do you think are the key steps to creating and implementing a policy, but also then getting that policy to be adhered to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd answer this in sort of two stages. Well, my first point would be that in terms of effective policies, keep the universe of policies fairly small. Kind of goes back onto Scott's point as well. Keep them as simple and as succinct as possible, and communicate them regularly. If people are buried in a pile of policies, they're a length of a book and filled with legalese, language they don't really understand or use in their day-to-day, you're wasting everyone's time. The second point here is the point about performance goals and incentives isn't so much that they drive compliant behavior, it's that they create an environment for non-compliant behavior. And what I mean by that is that we need performance goals and incentives, of course, but some will create more compliance risks than others. The person with revenue goals will have more pressure to cut corners to achieve their goals than someone who works in IT, for example. And unreasonably high goals create more risk. So the article points out that we should recognize which people or teams have a greater risk of non-compliance based on these goals and incentives, and address the elevated risk.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Scott?
I think I would just, echo that you wind up, you've got the people that have the sales goals, or outside of financial services, somebody who's got the goal of getting the oil well up and running by October 1st. It's inherent that they're going to, it's just part of the job. Nobody's saying you can't have performance goals, but recognize that some people are going to have more pressure. And so you make them a little bit higher risk when you're looking at your controls. You may audit them once a year instead of once every 3 years, for instance. I think that's just good judgment, but I really haven't seen that explicitly laid out in a lot of firms where they say, let's take a look at the risk that we are creating by these various types of incentives. But more broadly, yeah, in terms of the whole policy environment, getting people to adhere to them, I'd repeat the points that I just made about the policies themselves, but also it ties back a little bit to this idea of tone from the top that a lot of people I've spoken to think of it in terms of tone from the top for each individual policy, but it's really about visibly showing that compliance in general is something that you take seriously. And I think there's a tendency when people join a new firm or a new company to kind of try to figure out which bits are important and which aren't. Is it really important that I do my attestation by close of business Friday? Can I do it a week from now? You need to send the message that this is actually something that we do take seriously, that is important. And the way that Hoda actually phrased it is very true. People will absorb the attitude from their managers. So I think that all these things kind of weave into a good cultural environment.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. I think perhaps alongside that tone and culture topic, some more sort of practical steps that we're seeing some of our clients and prospects take, which is looking at their market abuse risk assessment, which the regulators encourage as the cornerstone document for surveillance firms. And they should be undertaking a much more detailed review of comms channels to ensure that the population of them is complete, the population of colleagues within the scope of monitoring is complete and consistent, and then obviously reviewing the risks that they're seeking to capture and obviously the resulting alert output. I think that also includes some of those attestations which you mentioned from the front office, and those would be potentially detailing all of the channels which are utilised for business, and then performing a reconciliation so that compliance teams can feel comfortable that they have the feeds which fall into the record keeping and surveillance solutions. I think that as a result of that, we've seen some extending and enhancement of existing arrangements, as well as I think some challenge back to the business regarding the nature and frequency of use of some of the channels, especially when there are economic consequences to having them. So the cost of monitoring, investigating and reporting is not for nothing. And if the business says they need 100 channels and you've given them a price for that, they may then reconsider. I think ultimately firms recognise they'll be questioned and challenged. And so, burying heads in sand is not going to work. So they need a better story. And this is going to result in no excuse for not capturing where they can, and the risk assessment process is a means to sort of evidence that you've taken reasonably intelligent and evidence-based steps to know that what you should know. I think it used to just focus on trade surveillance, that document, and I think there's much more being done on comms, and that's the message really, I think. Look at all the risks and manage them effectively as looking at, and then I guess the last point around that would be seek to try and look at the emerging risks and not just the ones that have happened historically.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And actually that leads really nicely into a question that we've got from a member of the audience actually around, so we've talked about the policy and we've talked about kind of setting yourself up for success, but what then happens if you've got these things in place and you discover some sort of violation? And does anyone here have any thoughts about whether self-reporting is kind of the right thing to be doing, or is it just then about doing your best to find where that violation is, find the relevant documents and resolve it internally?
I think my experience of that would be you obviously exhaust the data and information that you can internally, so you get a full picture of the extent and intent of the wrongdoing. But you need to figure out what that is. And if it's a regulatory breach, then yes, that is a reporting to the regulator and having that approach. And I think we've heard a number of different messages from, I think, global regulators where self-reporting is viewed very much better and much more leniently as a consequence of the resulting outcomes. And I think just builds a better position of trust with a regulator if they know that you're going to do that.
Yeah, there have been some kind of quite massive reductions in fines where people have worked alongside the regulators. So it definitely seems like it's what the regulators want to see. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I think one thing I would add is, as part of the training and a robust sort of compliance program, it is also very important to have a very sturdy speak up culture, allowing misconduct to be reported, so that you can deal with them at a lower level than if they become more serious violations. And so I would urge a very sort of robust speak up environment where there are various channels for employees to report instances of misconduct, whether it be from senior management or those at their same level.
That's a very good point. And I think also to Rob's point, it's always a good, once you've got the facts and you know what's going on, it's always, I think, a good idea to do the self-reporting, because think of the alternative. There's a very good chance that whatever the violation is may come to light sooner or later anyway. And it's not a good look to be there saying, well, yeah, I knew about it, but I didn't tell you about it. That's not an easy conversation to have with the regulators. And especially if you exacerbate that by dragging your feet on the information request once they do start looking at it. So I think a lot of people miss Rob's initial point, though, which is very important, which is, don't panic and say by sundown we need to call the regulator. Get your facts first, and show that you actually document that you detected it, that you investigated it, and that you're coming to them with a plan to move forward.
It's really interesting here that actually there seems to be a common theme throughout, which is that most of the solutions lead back to putting or implementing a good company culture from the outset. So whether it's a speak up kind of environment, or whether it's just, if people feel that they're in a culture of good compliance, then they're probably less likely to do bad acts. It's funny how that just kind of appears to show itself. And it's something that the regulators, I think, are really catching on to. A question here around senior management, which I think is actually a really difficult area to tackle. But if you're then to notice that there is potentially somebody who's not, there's some misconduct at the top of the management scheme, maybe somebody above your level, how do you act when that's uncovered and kind of weed that out?
Yeah, I'd say that's really tough. And to Hoda's point, the whistleblowing speak up culture would be the area which would be the obvious first choice. I think we've seen a few of those occasions, and I referred earlier to some of the conduct issues which we've seen over the course of the year, where extremely senior, and in Chris Binodi's case, the most senior person clearly was answerable to no one. It came to light that his executive board identified his behaviour as being unreasonable and asked him to address it, and he decided to sack them. Now, I think the regulator plays a role here too, because if they were aware of that, and I think that's still being investigated, then they really should have seen that those alarm bells were very serious. But I think that probably is where the whistleblowing regime needs to work as well as it can, and you protect the confidentiality of the individual, so there's no victimization or comeback on them. And that's really where you're able to do it. I think that it's very easy to say, look, let's all have a good conduct and everything, a good culture, and then everything's okay. Introducing that, maintaining it, retaining the hearts and minds of the folks, and making sure that they believe that everybody has got that right, and they're correctly treated in a highly pressurized environments on occasion, isn't easy. That's not to say it shouldn't be attempted and continually plugged away at, but nevertheless, I think it is pretty tough, and it's also very tough to measure. So for somebody like the regulator who extols the virtues of a good conduct and culture, making sure that that's tracked or trending in the direction they want is not as straightforward as it seems.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Does anyone else have anything to add on that? No?
Yeah, I mean, I second Rob's point there. That the first point would be the whistleblowing channels to report on senior management misconduct. However, I think it's important also to know that even senior managers or people in leadership aren't beyond reproach, and that there are specific accountability measures put in place in the organization where everybody is accountable to somebody. I think that's an important element as well, so that someone at the top can't just do what they want, because obviously that sets a bad trend and taints the culture of the organization as well.
Yeah, it's true. And actually, I think coming back to what you were saying about training as well, it's realizing it's not just training for the kind of junior members of staff, but it's training for everyone, and human, realistic training, so people really understand what is expected of them and what kind of the consequences are if they don't adhere to that, which obviously might get overlooked sometimes. I'm going to move on to a slightly more philosophical question around the use of the word defensible. So defensible has been used a number of times. You know, we need to make sure we've got a defensible policy in place, or you're doing enough to be defensible. But how do you know if you're doing enough to be defensible?
You need to be able to show that there was a reason why you took the steps you did, that you did some sort of analysis, that you didn't, just throw something out there without any real thought, and that you are monitoring it. It's going to depend a little bit on the policy or the infraction that you're dealing with, but you kind of have to walk through what can we do and what can't we do. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough. And going back to something I had said earlier, whatever you do, make sure you implement it, because history is filled with firms that have gotten a lot of fines for having something great on paper, but it was never really implemented. The procedures weren't there, or they weren't carried through. To Hoda's point, it was a cookbook with no recipes. Here's what our culture is going to be. Here's what our policy is going to be, and it just lost that.
Yeah, I was going to pretty much echo those thoughts. I think if you have the correct policy and procedure and it's followed, then I think the regulator takes a much more lenient view in that you've followed a path which has been prescribed, and if you end up in the wrong place or at the wrong conclusion, you've at least had an evidence-based conversation to get there. I think inevitably in most of these situations, you're making decisions on the basis of imperfect or somewhat incomplete information. And it's really easy to look back at post that and see all the information in front of you and maybe second guess that with the benefit of hindsight. But I think the decisions need to be taken. Otherwise, you're paralyzed, and you also need to be in a position where you take responsibility for those decisions on the basis of the information that you've got. And I think that's where I would say I'm able to defend my position. If I've done that, and I've, to the best of my knowledge, with a full and happy heart, I've tried to do what I think is the best thing under those circumstances, and hopefully that will be reflected in what the penalties or the implications of that if a regulator or an auditor or somebody else then challenges later down the path.
Like that, with a full and happy heart.
I think one other point is.
Sorry, Scott.
One other point is that the regulators, they will, they understand, they want to help the industry get to a good place, and so they will tell you, we want to be your partners in this. Sometimes that's going to feel like the partnership between a lion and a zebra, but it's a partnership nonetheless, and it gets to be a discussion.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's it, isn't it? As a partnership, I think it's easy to draw a line and say this is us and that's them, but actually, working in tandem is really important. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to end it there. But I just firstly want to say thank you so much to everyone who's attended today, and just apologise again for the slight technical difficulties we had at the beginning. You probably missed my shameless plug, so I'm going to do it again. We have published a fantastic report today, which interviews or has a survey of over 10,000 financial services firms basically looking at how they are capturing communication. So if you're interested in learning how your peers are capturing communications, you can download that from the resources section, as well as the report that we talked about today. And as well as we mentioned, Hoda's fantastic article around tone at the top and practical steps actually away from that. And that just leaves me to say thank you to Scott, Rob and Hoda for taking the time to join us today and impart some really interesting and insightful pearls of wisdom upon us all. So thank you very much. And I'll let you all go.